Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, do you ever get tired of being forced to choose between two imperfect alternatives? When I was a kid in school, I was given a multiple choice test like, what's the main point of this paragraph? I would sometimes just protest internally because I didn't like any of the provided answers. It seemed the intended correct answer missed something or didn't state it as accurately as I wanted, or I felt that the person who wrote the test made assumptions and that there were actually more than one correct answer depending on interpretation. So what do? You're forced to pick the best choice between the predetermined answers provided. And maybe that's why I can identify with the story I just read from Matthew 22. Jesus was given a similar choice, and he seems frustrated too. Two groups who don't like him, the Pharisees and the Herodians, set out a false choice. It's a test to entrap him. Pharisees and Herodians were not natural allies. The Herodians supported the interests of Herod, who represented Rome and Caesar Augustus. They were essentially the political establishment who the most pious looked down on as corrupt and compromised. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were the prevailing religious faithful. They had an uncompromising devotion to following the letter of the law and being personally pious and unwavering. The Herodians saw Jesus as a threat to Rome. The Pharisees saw Jesus as a sellout because he seemed to violate Sabbath laws and he didn't dot the I's and cross the T's to their satisfaction. They had no common interest, these two groups, except apparently in knocking Jesus down. And so they present a question to him not because they care about his answer in the end, but because they want him to either upset Rome or the crowds. The question is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? The Roman Empire was occupying their land, and it was a constant thorn in their flesh. The Herodians were collaborators with Rome, and the Pharisees were the indignant critics. As one commentator puts it, the conundrum for Jesus is this: if he answers yes, it's lawful to pay taxes, then he would be perceived as colluding with Rome, justifying Roman occupation and oppression of the Jews. This would not be a popular answer among the Jewish people. And on the other hand, if Jesus answers no, then he could be suspected of revolutionary sentiment against Rome. Jesus again answers, "Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this and whose title?" And they answered, "The emperor's." And then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." Now you could easily hear this response and think, well, that sounds like a politician. He's dodging the question. In other words, clever response, but it's not very straightforward. And I can kind of appreciate that perspective. To quote another verse from Matthew 10, he's being as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a dove. But I actually see it a little differently. Jesus isn't trying to get off easy or dodge the question, be political in his answer per se. He's not being hypocritical. Actually, it's the opposite. If you understand what he's really saying, he's standing tall in front of two groups who are themselves being pretty disingenuous, and he's giving a response that isn't one of their predetermined options, but better represents his actual beliefs. Jesus chooses an alternative answer. Today's graphic is an actual Roman coin showing the Emperor Augustus. It's in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. And similar to the coin you saw, a denarius had the image of the emperor stamped on it, and it read, Tiberius Caesar, August, son of the divine Augustus. That was on one side, and then Pontifex Maximus on the other. In plain English, Son of God and High Priest. Caesar was called Son of God. So Jesus has just made an incredibly bold statement for that day. He separates the words Caesar and God. They're not one and the same. He says, give to Caesar or the emperor what he is due, and give to God what is God's. Do you hear how it's just a little bit more in your face than the political answer it kind of comes across as? And so, what belongs to Caesar? Obviously, he made the coin and his image is on it, so go ahead and give it to him. But what belongs to God? Well, the people in that crowd would have all known this verse from Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. In other words, God is the creator. In the end, everything belongs to God. We're just stewards and caretakers of it. The emperor just gets a coin. So go ahead, give it to him. Jesus actually takes time to articulate with precision what he believes. In that way, he speaks with integrity rather than just choosing one of the predetermined answers. On the other hand, Jesus calls the two camps that are testing him hypocrites. They don't truly care about the content of his answer. Their only intent is to entrap him. For the moment, they've identified a common enemy and they're teaming up. And there's nothing inherently wrong with finding common cause with others that you don't always agree with. In fact, we could probably use more of that these days. But for the moment, the identity of both groups is being formed around what they're against rather than what they're for. You know, we live at a time when it's tempting to define ourselves solely by what we're against rather than what we truly believe. There's danger when we do proactively state what we're for. We open ourselves up to opposing arguments or disagreement. And if we really articulate our own precise beliefs, we might find ourselves even diverging slightly from those with otherwise like minds, and it could cause perhaps a rift with those that we care about. You can see examples today of public figures who take a different perspective than their group just maybe once in 100 times, and they receive withering criticism and even threats. And I would love to live in a world where there's room for more diversity of perspectives and thoughts, and where there can be constructive dialogue and debate. And the only way that happens is when we do our best to articulate our values and beliefs with integrity. And those values and beliefs may in fact line up with common and shared answers. But if we do have a unique perspective, we should feel free to articulate that in a respectful way that still seeks shared goals and the good of others. Sometimes it's in the nuance that we find our own humanity and the humanity of both our neighbor and those we would otherwise consider enemies. We can find ourselves venturing out into less traveled pathways and discovering even a single point of shared interest, even with someone we didn't expect. And so integrity requires courage, the bravery to speak what you see, but then also the bravery to listen to another point of view and compare notes and perhaps learn something. So what do we learn from the response that Jesus gives? The question of whether to pay taxes to some authority or government that you don't agree with is a live question for some today. It's not entirely an ancient issue. Folks today may try to evade taxes for this very reason. Well, that's not particularly biblical if you're looking at this passage of Scripture. At least from a Christian standpoint, you're not violating your faith if you fund a government as a citizen if it does things you disagree with. You may come up with your own moral or ethical reasons for not doing so or doing so, but at least based on this passage, it's not a deal breaker. You won't be spiritually or morally impure for doing so in the eyes of Jesus. You can maintain your integrity if that's what you're worried about. But we find our integrity ultimately as Christians in remembering who everything belongs to in the end. You can give the coin to the emperor or whoever because the emperor isn't going to have it in the end either. It's all temporary. 2,000 years later, Emperor Augustus is gone. The Roman Empire has vanished. The Herodians were supporters of Rome and Caesar. They're gone. All the battles they fought are now in the past. Principles and values live on if we pass them on. Our faith lives on in those we share it with. As Christians, we look all around us and we believe everything is a gift of God, the creator of the universe. We just have it for a moment. It's a gift for us to enjoy, but also to share, to provide for ourselves and those we love, but also for neighbors and strangers. And so if we give to God the things that are God's, we share from what we have, even if it may seem little. As Paul writes in Philippians 4, "For I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." By acknowledging where our coins or possessions ultimately come from, we ground ourselves in a more fundamental and existential view of life. It's a spiritual view of life. Giving to God means supporting the gospel that endures and our neighbors in need. By doing so, we join a larger mission and movement and share in that human story rather than only living for ourselves. We have these words and wisdom from someone who saw his own life as something not to be used only for himself, but for our sake. Jesus was generous and gracious in the way he welcomed people and forgave people, in the way he healed and brought hope. And all these gifts are given today to you as well, through the one who gave his life freely for all. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.